Welcome back to Project 613. We are going to continue today with the mitzvah of achalta v'savata v'erachta. When one eats, one has to bless Hashem. And as mentioned yesterday, the only biblical obligation over here is the grace after meals, when we bless Hashem after we eat a satisfying meal. However, our rabbis introduced blessings for all the foods even before we eat. So before we partake of any food, there is a specific blessing for each type of food. For fruits that grow from the tree, we make borei pri ha'etz. For vegetables, we say borei pri ha'adama. For wine and grape juice, we say borei pri ha'gafen. For any baked goods that are made out of the 5 grains, but not bread itself, we would say borei mini mizonot. And for bread itself, as mentioned yesterday, we say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And for anything else that is not included in the previous list, we have a general blessing, shehakol niyah b'dvaro, and we thank Hashem and acknowledge that everything has come about through His word. Now, here's a general rule when it comes to blessings. Usually, any specific food we want to partake of, we have to make the appropriate blessing for that given food. But when we're eating a meal, which we washed and had bread and said hamotzi lechem min haaretz, then once we said the blessing of hamotzi on the bread, then we do not have to make a separate blessing on any of the other food that's going to be included in the meal. Any other food that's going to be part of the meal is covered by the blessing of hamotzi that we make right in the beginning before we eat the bread. However, even during a meal, if we eat food that is not part of the meal itself, rather is like an extra that isn't part of the satisfying element of the meal itself, then we would have to make a separate blessing. For example, if one washes and has a meal, they don't have to make a blessing on any of the courses that come out during the meal. But if one decides to have wine during the meal, they would have to make a separate blessing of borei pri ha'gafen, because that is not covered in the hamotzi. Similarly, at the end of a meal, if a person eats dessert, when the dessert comes out, one makes a separate blessing on the dessert because the dessert is not considered part of the satisfying element of the meal itself, rather an extra, and therefore a person makes a separate blessing on that. Now, an exception to the exception is on Shabbos. During the Shabbos meal, of course, one does not have to make the hagafen blessing if one decides to have a cup of wine during the meal. One does not make a hagafen on the wine, and the reason for that is because we have already made the hagafen when we made kiddush before the meal, and therefore we are covered through the hagafen that we made on the kiddush. But if not for that, we would have had to make a separate borei pri hagafen while drinking wine during a meal. Another law that we learn together with all the laws of blessings is that before we eat a meal that requires us to wash, if we're having bread, then we are required to wash our hands and make the blessing of al netilat yadayim. This is done only if we are eating bread that requires the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Before eating of such bread, that is when one is required to wash the hands 3 times on the right, 3 times on the left, and to make the blessing asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. And it is also an essential part of the mitzvah to make sure that one's hands are dried properly after one makes that blessing, and after one washes their hands before they eat the bread, they need to make sure their hands are dry. Between making the blessing of al netilat yadayim and the blessing of hamotzi lechem min haaretz, it is forbidden to speak. One does not talk. One should remain silent until one makes the blessing on the bread. Have a wonderful day.